Hello, everyone. I'm a practicing therapist and a doctoral student in psychology, and a large part of my clinical work revolves around individuals with avoidant attachment patterns. Over the years, I've worked with many avoidantly attached clients, and what has become increasingly clear is not just how unique each person is, but how often certain underlying patterns repeat across their lives. As therapy continues, I don't only see who the person was at the beginning of treatment, but also how their attachment style shows up in their romantic relationships, family systems, work struggles, and general life difficulties. These areas tend to overlap in meaningful ways, and that consistency is something I regularly observe in my clinical practice and take seriously when understanding their emotional world. Another pattern I've noticed in my work involves anger and emotional regulation. I also specialize in working with anger-related issues and personality-related difficulties, so I often see how these areas overlap in the same individuals. Many of the clients who come to me for anger struggles also present with avoidant attachment patterns, whether dismissive or fearful. I can't say that all avoidant individuals struggle with anger, but in my clinical experience, a large portion of those with significant anger concerns do show avoidant traits. One possible explanation is that these individuals are often not given safe or healthy space to express their emotions directly. As a result, feelings that are suppressed or unspoken can build up internally and eventually come out in the form of anger, especially in close relationships. Today, I want to explore how you can recognize when an avoidantly attached person has actually formed an emotional bond, and more importantly, who they tend to form that bond with. This matters because when avoidant individuals truly bond, they are often far more committed than people assume, and they usually do not easily walk away. However, they are also very selective about who they become attached to in the first place. One of the first signs I look for is how someone responds to the idea of agreeing to disagree. When a partner can hold their own opinion without pushing for control or constant agreement and instead allows space for differences, it creates a strong sense of acceptance for the avoidant person. It signals emotional safety, reduces conflict pressure, and allows them to feel respected rather than controlled. The second major factor is time and long-term presence in their life. Many avoidantly attached individuals tend to form emotional bonds with people who have consistently been there over a long period of time. It is not necessarily about intensity or dramatic emotional experiences, but more about steady presence and reliability. When someone remains in their life through different phases, ups and downs, and moments of distance, that continuity becomes meaningful. Even if avoidant individuals do not always express it openly, they tend to value familiarity and the sense that someone has not given up on them. Over time, that ongoing presence builds a form of attachment that becomes difficult for them to detach from because the relationship is tied to consistency and lived history. Usually, this shows up most clearly in relationships that are not constantly breaking apart and restarting. Avoidantly attached individuals tend to feel safest with a partner who has shown up consistently over time, offering steadiness, emotional support, and a sense of familiarity they can rely on. In many cases, especially with fearful avoidant patterns, once they finally decide that someone is right for them, they tend to hold on to that choice quite firmly. It's a bit like taking a long time to research something important, like a house or a car, weighing every detail carefully, but once the decision is made, the commitment becomes strong and intentional. The same applies to relationships. They invest deeply in the person they've chosen, and that connection becomes something they don't easily let go of. So when there is long-term stability and consistent presence, they are far more likely to stay committed than people often assume. Another important factor is self-awareness in the relationship. Avoidant individuals are especially drawn to partners who can reflect on their own behavior and understand how it impacts the dynamic between them. For example, if you recognize that you may be texting too often while they are focused on work, and instead of demanding they adjust, you acknowledge your part in it, that creates a strong sense of emotional safety for them. This kind of self-awareness reduces tension and defensiveness because it shows that you are not placing all the responsibility on them to manage the relationship alone. Instead, it communicates maturity, respect, and a willingness to grow. Over time, This tends to feel very grounding and even deeply attractive to them because it allows trust to build naturally and helps them open up without feeling pressured or criticized. Avoidantly attached individuals also respond very strongly to healthy patterns of mutual apology within a relationship. When both people are able to take responsibility for their actions, it creates an atmosphere where vulnerability feels safer and less threatening. If you can acknowledge when you've acted from anxiety or overstepped a boundary, and you express genuine care for how it affected them, it signals emotional maturity and investment in the relationship. This does not mean taking all the blame, but rather showing awareness of your role and a willingness to repair when needed. For avoidant individuals, this is particularly meaningful because it communicates that their needs are recognized and valued rather than dismissed. In turn, they often feel more comfortable owning their own mistakes as well. This balance reduces fear around conflict and gradually strengthens commitment because the relationship starts to feel like a shared space where both people are accountable and both people matter. Avoidantly attached individuals tend to deeply admire people who can respond in a grounded, non-reactive way when expectations or needs don't perfectly align. For example, in situations where one partner is more anxious and prefers frequent contact, while the avoidant partner naturally needs more space and time alone, tension can easily build if both people interpret the difference as rejection or neglect. If the avoidant individual clearly communicates their limits, such as preferring to meet once a week instead of every other day, they are not necessarily rejecting the relationship, but expressing what feels manageable for them. In that moment, the emotional outcome often depends less on the disagreement itself and more on how the other person responds. If the reaction is highly emotional, blaming, or escalating, the avoidant person is more likely to shut down and withdraw, because it reinforces their internal sense that closeness leads to pressure or conflict. However, when the response is calm, accepting, and emotionally regulated, even if it includes disappointment, it creates a very different internal experience for them. If the partner can acknowledge their own feelings while still respecting the boundary, it communicates emotional safety rather than emotional demand. Something like recognizing the difference, accepting the current limitation, and expressing openness to revisiting the topic later allows the avoidant individual to stay engaged rather than retreat. It removes the sense of being cornered or forced into immediate change. Over time, this kind of interaction can actually increase their willingness to meet more needs, not because they are pressured into it, but because they feel understood rather than controlled. That feeling of being understood is often what allows emotional bonding to deepen. Another quality that strongly influences emotional bonding for avoidant individuals is a preference for peace over constant emotional volatility. This doesn't mean avoiding all conflict or suppressing important conversations, but rather approaching disagreements in a way that preserves emotional stability in the relationship. When both partners are able to recognize when a discussion is becoming too heated and choose to pause instead of escalating it, it creates a sense of emotional containment. Stepping back, doing something neutral or positive together, and returning to the issue later when both people are calmer often feels much safer for avoidant individuals than forcing immediate resolution in a high-intensity moment. This kind of emotional pacing communicates that the relationship itself is not in danger every time there is disagreement. It also reduces the internal pressure they often feel when conflict escalates quickly. As a result, they can stay more present instead of withdrawing. In the same way, avoidantly attached individuals tend to bond strongly with partners who allow room for small mistakes without turning them into repeated criticisms or emotional punishments. When errors are met with patience rather than judgment, it creates a relational environment that feels safe to exist in. Over time, that sense of safety becomes the foundation for deeper emotional attachment, because the relationship is no longer experienced as something they must constantly defend themselves within. In real relationships, especially long-term ones like marriage or committed partnerships, it's very normal for small mistakes to happen and still be repaired without damage to the bond. For example, one partner may say they are okay with their spouse going out with friends as long as they return by a certain time because there are responsibilities the next day. The intention is not control, but coordination and care for shared responsibilities. Now imagine the partner gets carried away and comes home later than agreed. It's not a major betrayal, just a small lapse in judgment or prioritization. The next morning, instead of avoiding the topic or reacting with suspicion or escalation, they acknowledge it openly. The response on the other side matters a lot. If it turns into interrogation or emotional punishment, it creates tension and insecurity. But if there is calm feedback, where the boundary is restated without hostility, the relationship stays emotionally safe while still holding accountability. What really strengthens emotional bonding, especially for avoidantly attached individuals, is when both people can remain themselves even in moments of disappointment. One partner is allowed to feel frustrated, the other is allowed to make a mistake, and neither has to collapse into blame or shutdown. The focus stays on understanding, adjusting, and moving forward rather than punishing or withdrawing. This kind of dynamic builds trust because it shows that the relationship can hold imperfection without breaking. When you step back and look at all of this together, the core elements that support bonding include agreeing to disagree, long-term consistency, self-awareness, mutual apologies, emotional regulation during conflict, a preference for peace over chaos, and tolerance for small human errors. When these qualities exist, emotional connection tends to deepen naturally over time because the relationship feels safe enough to stay in. What ties all of this together is the idea that emotional bonding for avoidantly attached individuals is less about intensity and more about emotional safety over time. They are often not drawn to the loudest connection or the most emotionally charged dynamic, but to the one that feels steady, predictable, and non-intrusive. When closeness feels like pressure, demand, or loss of autonomy, they tend to pull back. But when closeness feels like choice, respect, and room to breathe, they gradually move closer without even always realizing it. The bond forms quietly through repeated experiences of "I can be myself here" without being controlled or overwhelmed. A key part of this is how conflict is handled. For many avoidant individuals, conflict isn't just disagreement. It can feel like emotional danger if it escalates quickly or becomes personal. So the partner who can slow things down, stay regulated, and keep the focus on the issue instead of attacking the person often becomes the emotional anchor in the relationship. Not because they never feel upset, but because they don't turn upset into threat. That difference matters more than people assume. It creates a pattern where conflict becomes something that can be worked through rather than something that signals the relationship is at risk. Another important layer is how autonomy is treated. Avoidant individuals are far more likely to stay emotionally engaged when they feel their independence is respected rather than questioned. This doesn't mean distance is always ideal, but it does mean forced closeness usually backfires. When a partner can say, "I want connection with you, but I'm not trying to take away your space," it reduces internal resistance. Over time, this balance of closeness and space becomes what makes the relationship feel sustainable rather than suffocating. There's also something subtle that happens with consistency. Many avoidant individuals have learned, often early in life, that emotional needs can be unpredictable or overwhelming. So when someone shows up in a stable, non-reactive way over time, it slowly rewires what they expect from relationships. They start to associate the person not with pressure, but with reliability. And reliability is what allows emotional dependency to develop in a healthy way for them, even if they don't express it in obvious or traditional forms. What people sometimes misunderstand is that avoidant individuals are not incapable of deep attachment. The attachment just doesn't always look emotionally expressive on the surface. In many cases, it shows up through consistency, loyalty, protective behavior, or staying in the relationship even when it would be easier to leave. But that staying is usually built on a foundation of feeling respected rather than controlled, understood rather than corrected, and accepted rather than constantly evaluated. So when you combine all of this, emotional bonding becomes less about getting more from them and more about creating an environment where closeness doesn't feel like a threat. In that environment, they don't just tolerate connection, they begin to rely on it. As that pattern continues, avoidantly attached individuals often begin to form what you could call earned reliance, even if they would never describe it that way. They still value independence, and that doesn't disappear, but they start to include the relationship in their sense of stability rather than seeing it as something that threatens their stability. So instead of moving away when emotions rise, they start to trust that the connection will still be there after the moment passes. That alone changes how they engage in difficult situations. A big part of this shift is repetition. One calm repair after a disagreement doesn't change much, but many experiences of conflict being handled safely begin to rewrite expectations. They learn, often unconsciously, that honesty doesn't automatically lead to rejection, that mistakes don't automatically lead to punishment, and that distance doesn't have to mean disconnection. These repeated experiences slowly soften their internal defenses, not by force, but by proof. At the same time, they tend to stay sensitive to emotional pressure. If the relationship repeatedly swings into criticism, urgency, or emotional escalation, they usually retreat again, sometimes without much explanation. But when the relationship maintains a rhythm of openness without intensity overload, they begin to stay engaged even during discomfort. That ability to stay present during tension is one of the clearest signs that emotional bonding has deepened. Over time, what looks like staying from the outside is actually a combination of trust, familiarity, and reduced internal threat response. They are not staying because they feel trapped or obligated, but because leaving no longer feels necessary for emotional safety. At a deeper level, what often changes is not just behavior, but interpretation. Early on, avoidantly attached individuals tend to interpret emotional closeness through a threat-based lens. Even neutral needs can feel like pressure, and normal relational expectations can feel like demands on their autonomy. But when they are consistently met with steadiness rather than escalation, that internal meaning starts to shift. The same request that once felt overwhelming begins to feel reasonable. The same conversation that once felt like criticism begins to feel like coordination between two people trying to understand each other. This is where emotional safety becomes more important than agreement. They don't need a partner who always sees things the same way, but they do need a partner whose disagreement does not turn into emotional volatility or withdrawal of care. When disagreement is handled with respect, it signals that connection is not conditional on compliance. That distinction is what allows them to remain emotionally engaged even when they are not fully aligned. Another important shift is how they begin to handle their own internal emotions. Many avoidant individuals are used to suppressing or compartmentalizing discomfort rather than expressing it directly. But in a stable relational environment, they sometimes begin to show small increases in emotional expression, even if it is indirect. It might come out as brief honesty, practical communication about needs, or small attempts at repair after distance. These are often understated, but they are meaningful signs of increasing trust. And gradually, the relationship becomes less about managing distance and more about maintaining connection, not in a constant, high-intensity way, but in a steady, regulated way where closeness is no longer something they have to protect themselves from. As this process continues over time, what often becomes most noticeable is that avoidantly attached individuals start to tolerate emotional closeness in a more sustained way. Earlier in the relationship, closeness might have triggered an automatic need to create space, whether through silence, distraction, or emotional withdrawal. But with enough experiences of safety, that automatic reaction begins to weaken. They don't lose their need for space, but they gain more choice in how they respond to emotional intensity. That shift from automatic distancing to intentional response is a key sign that bonding has deepened. Another important development is how they begin to engage in repair after conflict. In more secure dynamics, repair is not delayed indefinitely or avoided altogether. It becomes something they can return to without feeling overwhelmed or threatened. Even if they need time alone after a disagreement, they are more likely to come back and re-engage rather than disconnecting completely. This ability to return after distance is often more important than never taking space at all, because it shows that separation is no longer being interpreted as relational danger. Over time, trust also becomes less about reassurance and more about expectation. They begin to assume, based on experience, that the relationship will remain intact through normal fluctuations. That internal assumption reduces anxiety-driven behaviors on both sides. Instead of constantly testing or protecting the relationship, they can focus more on living inside it. And in that shift, emotional bonding becomes less fragile and more stable, even if it still looks relatively quiet from the outside. Eventually, what holds the connection together is not constant emotional expression, but a shared history of handling difficult moments without damage to the bond. That history becomes the foundation they rely on when things feel uncertain. As that shared history builds, something important happens internally. The relationship starts to become part of their baseline sense of stability, rather than something they have to actively manage or protect against. For avoidantly attached individuals, this is a significant shift because early relational experiences are often organized around self-protection and emotional independence. But when a partner consistently demonstrates steadiness through both closeness and conflict, the nervous system begins to update its expectations. Emotional proximity becomes less associated with loss of control and more associated with familiarity. At this stage, small relational moments carry more weight than dramatic ones. Things like checking in without pressure, following through on simple agreements, or handling misunderstandings without escalation start to accumulate into a felt sense of safety. These are not always consciously recognized, but they shape how the relationship is experienced day to day. Instead of interpreting closeness as something that needs to be managed carefully, it begins to feel like something that naturally exists alongside independence. Another shift is that avoidantly attached individuals often become more responsive rather than reactive. Where they might have previously shut down or distanced themselves quickly during emotional intensity, they begin to slow down internally. They may still need space, but the urgency behind the withdrawal decreases. That reduction in urgency is important because it means the relationship is no longer triggering a survival-like response. Over time, this creates a different kind of attachment pattern, one that is less about avoidance of closeness and more about regulation within closeness. The bond remains, but it is no longer maintained through distance. Instead, it is maintained through the ability of both people to stay connected even when things are imperfect. As this stabilizes further, the relationship often starts to feel more predictable in an emotional sense. Not predictable in a boring or lifeless way, but in the sense that the avoidantly attached person no longer feels like they have to brace themselves for sudden emotional escalation, withdrawal of affection, or unpredictable reactions. That sense of bracing is what usually keeps them slightly guarded in the early stages of connection. When it gradually fades, their emotional availability increases in small but meaningful ways. You may also notice that they begin to participate more consistently in the relationship without it being explicitly demanded. This doesn't usually show up as constant verbal reassurance or overt emotional expression. Instead, it looks like steadier communication, more willingness to resolve issues rather than avoid them, and a greater capacity to stay engaged during emotionally uncomfortable conversations. The key difference is that engagement no longer feels like a threat to their autonomy. At the same time, their need for space doesn't disappear, but it becomes less defensive. Space is no longer used primarily as a protective escape from emotional intensity. Instead, it becomes a normal rhythm within the relationship that both partners understand and respect. This makes the dynamic feel less like pursuit and withdrawal and more like a balanced rhythm of connection and separation that both people can trust. Over time, this is what deep bonding often looks like for avoidantly attached individuals. Not dramatic emotional dependence, but a quiet, steady integration of the partner into their sense of everyday life and emotional safety. As this quiet stability continues, the avoidantly attached individual often begins to invest in the relationship in ways that are not always obvious from the outside. Rather than sudden emotional declarations or intense displays of attachment, their commitment tends to show up through consistency, reliability, and presence over time. They may not always verbalize what they feel, but they demonstrate it by continuing to choose the relationship even when there is no external pressure to do so. Another important shift is how they handle uncertainty. Earlier on, uncertainty in a relationship can feel uncomfortable enough to trigger distancing behaviors or emotional withdrawal. But with enough repeated experiences of safety, uncertainty becomes less threatening. They begin to trust that not every uncomfortable moment signals the end of connection. This allows them to stay engaged during ambiguity rather than immediately stepping back to regain control. You may also notice that they start to initiate more in subtle ways. This could be small check-ins, practical forms of care, or attempts to maintain connection that are not emotionally overwhelming for them, but still meaningful in consistency. These actions often carry more significance than they appear to, because they represent a willingness to move toward connection rather than away from it. Over time, what develops is a relationship where emotional closeness is no longer something they actively resist, but something they can exist within without losing their sense of self.